I think most of our time spent together is actually in the rock climbing gym.
Yeah.
But Chris is going to tell us about predicting the future of biological systems, but he's also done some really cool work around microcosms. Also got a really good Instagram game, so check that out.
Okay, morning everyone, thanks for coming. So this is some work I've been doing over the last 3 years and still continuing, generally centred on early warning signals and predicting population collapse. Okay, so biological systems are inherently very complex. They're non-stationary, high-dimensional, non-linear, stochastic, they show low signal-to-noise ratio, they're subject to positive and negative feedback loops, and they display alternative stable states and hysteresis. But given current rates of biodiversity loss, there's never been a more important time to try and be able to predict the future state of these systems. I'm not going to labour the point too much because we all know exactly what it is, so I'm just going to skip this very quickly. But we know biodiversity loss is greater than it's been at any time in recent history. There have been huge losses, particularly over the last 100 years. Just to pull two very quick examples. The Living Planet Index published in 2014 showed that on average, vertebrate species populations are about half the size they were 40 years ago. And a paper from 2015 showed that the number of species that have gone extinct in the last century would have taken between 800 and 10,000 years to disappear at historic background extinction rates. Okay, so if we want to predict the future of biological populations, from a conservation perspective, we have limited resources, limited funding. So if we can predict those populations that are most at risk of collapse, we can target those populations with that funding, with those resources, and try and save them. So what are ways to do this? Well, process to pattern ways are kind of maybe a gold standard way of approaching this issue. So typically they're called mechanistic models or tactical models. So in these you would explicitly account for interaction between species, the effects of environment on any given organism. And to do this you build up a complicated mathematical model. It requires a lot of data to do that because you need to account for all different species interactions. And they're mostly limited to high economic value sectors such as fishery or forestries. And they can give really accurate predictions of what that system is going to do in the future, but because of the data requirements, they have very limited usefulness, particularly in the field of conservation. Another option might be looking at pattern-to-process methods. So can we look at patterns in the data and infer that there are changes in the underlying processes which govern a system? And this is kind of the rationale behind the search for early warning signals. So can you infer changes in the population, community, or an ecosystem from observed patterns and in the data? And the nice thing about this is that you require relatively little data to do that, maybe just the abundance time series of a population. So just to give you some quick background on so-called generic early warning signals. So these are based on a phenomenon called critical slowing down. It's a really generic phenomenon of dynamic systems, so it can be found in financial markets and a load of other different systems. And it basically says that as you approach a bifurcation or a tipping point, that you expect a system to take longer to return to its previous state. So just to give you a cartoon example of this, here we have a population fluctuating through time and it collapses. And you can see that as you move towards this collapse, there's an increase in the magnitude of these fluctuations prior to that tipping point. And what we can do is then, say, measure the variance of this time series in this blue window, slide that blue window towards the tipping point, and you should see this characteristic increase in the variance before the collapse occurs. And you can use this increase in variance as an early warning signal of population collapse. So in biological systems, these early warning signals have typically been looked for in abundance or biomass data, and they're very general and make really few assumptions about the underlying nature of the system, other than it should show some kind of critical transition. So for those of you who are familiar with alternative stable states theory, these kind of classic kind of ball and cup diagrams, a lot of this work is derived from that theory where you kind of have loss of resilience within the system. I should point out that you don't actually have to have a bifurcation for a system to show critical slowing down and early warning signals. You just have to have strong nonlinearity in response to a linear forcing. So there's been a lot of work that's been really in vogue for about the last 15 years. There's been a whole bunch of very high impact papers on this showing they've been detectable in population collapse, community collapse, ecosystems, the abrupt change in climate, financial systems before large financial crashes, and also in neurons and prior to epileptic attacks in humans. The problem is a lot of those systems have really, really high quality, very long time series data. And in a conservation context, we know that mostly that data is just not present. And ecological data is particularly noisy. And a lot of this comes from incomplete sampling. So if we go out and we try and count individuals of a population, we're never going to be able to count every single one. And so that's just limited by funding, the amount of people you can send out to look for them, individuals being cryptic or habitats being really heterogeneous. So just to kind of give you a cartoon example of that again, here we have a population residing in a habitat. You might sample 20% of the habitat, count 5 individuals, and erroneously think that the entire habitat contained 25 individuals. Searching a different 20%, you might count a much lower number, and of course the less of the habitat you sample, the more likely you are to get really skewed interpretations of what the actual population dynamics are. And why is that important? Well, generic early warning signals are based on these subtle fluctuations in the population. And to detect those subtle fluctuations, your estimates of the population need to really carefully track the underlying actual population dynamics. So we've shown previously using simulated and also experimental data that as you subsample the habitat more and more, the efficacy of these early warning signals to predict population collapse drastically drops off. So for some of them, you're needing to sample almost 100% of the population's habitat to get accurate counts of the population before you're getting consistently reliable early warning signals. And so this is kind of part of a body of work that showed that these kind of generic abundance of biomass-based early warning signals are often harder to distinguish from noise. They may not be present prior to many different kinds of bifurcations, and also have been shown to be potentially unreliable predictors of real-world transitions, although there's some issues with the way that they present that analysis. So this got us wondering, well, are there some alternative measures of stability that would give us more reliable indicators of when a population is at risk of collapse? Well, we know that the effects of environmental change on demographic rates of a population are mediated through the phenotypes of the individuals within that population. That's particularly true for fitness-related phenotypic traits. Body size is a key trait that people tend to talk about a lot. I mean, that's because it affects reproductive success, survival of individuals, the effects density dependence on individuals, etc., etc. Actually, if you kind of think about this, well, if a habitat is deteriorating, then individuals in that habitat may start to lose body mass prior to changes in the demography. So an individual might start to lose body mass before it starts to die or stop reproducing. And so you might actually see these shifts in the mass, the body mass of individuals in the population prior to change in the demography, and therefore those classic early warning signal, abundance-based early warning signals and fluctuations. So we wonder, right, can we use this trait shift as a predictor of population collapse with a particular focus on body size, not only because it is a key fitness-related trait, but it also is one of the few traits that's regularly collected alongside abundance data. And there's kind of some anecdotal evidence that this might be the case, that we could predict collapse from shifts in body size. So this is a paper published in 2003 that showed that there was a significant decline in body size prior to the extinction of this prehistoric horse. Okay, so to get at this question, I did a protist microcosm experiment. So protists, ciliate, single-celled organisms. The really nice thing about these is they're really, really small. You can put them in petri dishes, you can build up communities, and you can have really complex dynamics coming out of those. So I use a 2-species predator-prey system here, Didinium nasutum feeding on Paramecium caudatum, and I manipulated the amount of food available through time and forced the Didinium populations to collapse. And doing this, we could track both the trait and abundance of these populations through time, the trait distribution and abundance of this population through time. And we could show that including trait information alongside abundance data could improve the predictive accuracy of the early warning signals methods. We included standard deviation of body size, trends in the standard deviation, and mean body size. We saw significant declines in mean body size and significant increases in standard deviation of body size prior to collapse. And the kind of increase in standard deviation of body size was quite interesting, so we think that's possibly due to size-dependent competition. The largest individuals are moving around more, they're taking more of the available prey, and so the smallest individuals are getting smaller and smaller, and the largest individuals are kind of staying large in response to this declining food availability. So the method we developed is really simple, so it's flexible. You can include the dynamics of one or more traits simultaneously from one or more species. So you can start thinking about using this in a multi-species context where you're tracking multiple traits from multiple species prior to a collapsed community or an ecosystem. So one of the reasons we're kind of interested in body size and trait data generally is that we thought it would be more robust to the spatial subsampling I was talking about earlier. We thought it's kind of self-evident. You're taking the mean of multiple individuals, and therefore it should be much more representative of the true underlying trend in the body size data. The reviewers were not so convinced by that, so we've recently kind of redone this analysis where we did the spatial subsampling, but using size spectra fisheries models of the North Sea. We're able to show that as you decline search effort, here the biomass data, so the red line is the true value, and you can see that as the search effort gets lower and lower, so towards the white lines, you're getting really wild estimates of the actual observed biomass, whilst in the trait data, so here on the right-hand side, you can see that the trait data always closely tracks the actual underlying value, and that's kind of is, I guess, an argument for using body size early warning signals at least more widely as a measure of ecosystem and population health. And also maybe an argument to start collecting more trait data as a measure of health in populations for conservation science. Okay, so we've shown that these trait-based signals were present in the small microcosmic experiments in the lab. We wanted to see if they were present in the real world before the collapse of actual real-world populations. I say actual real-world, wild populations. So to test this, we need to have body size data on individuals and also abundance data, critically that precede a population collapse. And whilst there's quite a lot of information on body size and abundance data on wild populations, it's rare to have observed collapses with the data preceding that. The data often comes after a collapse or in the few years before it, as people are kind of starting to worry about that species. So during a visit to IMAS at the University of Tasmania, we came up with the idea of looking for these signals in the overharvesting of whales during the 20th century. So there's a fantastic open access data set by the IWC, International Whaling Commission. So they collated, they think, every single known legally caught whale in the 20th century between 1900 and 1985. So we looked at 4 species of this, and for those 4 species, there was over 2 million individual whales caught during that period of time. It's a global database, and we know that there are large population collapses caused by overexploitation. And they also include body size for most of the individuals caught, because that's quite it was something that was interesting to them, because obviously the larger individuals have more economic value. So just to give you an idea of the scale of this, so each of the points on here is a whale caught that had its location recorded. Not all of them had their location recorded. You can see there's absolutely staggering numbers taken out in that 85-year period. Just to look at the data a bit more carefully, so this is a little bit small, sorry about this. So the x-axis here is the year, y-axis is the number of whales caught. You can see that there's this sharp increase in the whales caught, followed by collapses. And these collapses are due to effectively the underlying populations collapsing. They're no longer economically viable, and you can see that actually through time, they start on blue whales, move on to fin whales, sei whales, and sperm whales as each of those populations become non-economically viable anymore. And there's a dip in the middle here, that's World War II, so there was still some whaling going on, but mostly ceased during that period. And so just to give you an idea of the number of whales being taken out per year. So this is obviously yearly counts of the blue whales. You're kind of peaking at over 30,000 individuals in a single year. So massive impacts on the ecosystems. In terms of change in the mean body size, this is 95th percentile mean body size. You can see that for blue, fin and sei whales, there's a characteristic increase over the first years of harvesting, followed by subsequent decreases into the future. And we think that's due to changes in the way that whaling was going on. So early on, you had just single boats going out and hunting whales. But later, as you got technological advancement, you started to have faster outrigging boats, exploding torpedoes, and so they're actually able to hunt the larger, faster-moving whale individuals. So you get this increase in body size followed by a decrease. That's not the same for sperm whales. So at the bottom part, you can see here, it just kind of declines through time. Sperm whales move about 10 miles an hour slower than a lot of the other species, so we think that's caused by that. If you look at the standard deviation of body size through time, you can see there's actually really consistent trends through all 4 of the species. Here, this characteristic increase as they fish out the largest individuals of their population, followed by declines as the largest individuals are all removed. So using this data, we were able to show that body size shifts occurred during overexploitation in this 85-year period. And the particularly drastic one was sperm whales caught in 1980 were on average about 4 meters shorter than those caught in 1900. And we got some shifts in body size and preceding population collapses, particularly shifts in the standard deviation of body size. And using the method that we developed in the Protist microcosms, we were able to predict the collapse of all 4 of these species. And if we included traits, we could show that you need less data to predict those collapses. And we could get consistent signals, early warning signals, picked up to about 40 years prior to the collapse in the longest time series data. But we know that wild populations are not just kind of homogeneous. So in the last analysis in the whales, we just assumed that all whales were effectively equal. So we didn't account for differences between females and males or juveniles. But we know that wild populations are age and stage structured. So we wondered, well, different ages and stages are differentially affected by environmental change, by density dependence. So are trait shifts in some age and stage classes more reliable predictors of collapse than in others? And this is some work I've been doing with the Surrey sheep. This is my only fieldwork photo, so I'm going to put it in every single presentation from now on. So I went up to the island of St Kilda. So St Kilda is this tiny archipelago off the northwest coast of Scotland. They've got this really long-term 30-year data set where they've been collecting every year the Surrey sheep. They're individually tagged, so they've got growth trajectories for all of the individuals, and they've got really accurate mortality for them as well, so they go out and find every single corpse after the winter season. And using this data, it's really awesome long-term data, we built integral projection models, so age-structured integral projection models, including this winter North Atlantic oscillation, which is a strong predictor of the population dynamics. So the winter North Atlantic oscillation is a weather front which moves across the North Atlantic every winter, and it really determines the weather that's there on St Kilda. And the weather is the main predictor of death and mortality during the winter season. So using this, we projected the population under future climate change scenarios. We were able to project not only accurately the abundance of the population, but also the trait dynamics at each stage class, so lamb-yielding, prime adults, and senescent individuals. And we were able to show that population collapses were preceded by shifts in the mean and standard deviation of body size. Particularly, the most reliable signals came in the lamb and senescent stages, so those that were most susceptible to environmental change. So this work kind of raised an interesting question. Well, trait shifts we know could indicate collapse, but they could also indicate adaptation. So depending on the rate at which the environment is changing, maybe also the plasticity and the genetic diversity of the population, that might indicate that a species is actually just changing and adapting to a climate change or environmental change, and then will spring back afterwards. And so it's really key to be able to use these in a real-world context, is to be able to pick apart when such signals would be indicative of collapse versus adaptation. This is some work my PhD student's been looking at. So he's using a quantitative genetic modelling approach and also some small-scale experiments based on the Protist system again, to try and untangle some of these. So I'm just going to quickly talk about this, cover some of his work. So the main portion of the current work he's been doing is looking at a simulation-based quantitative genetic model. So it's a closed population with non-overlapping and discrete generations, and density-dependent population regulation. He's tracked the trait shifts and population sizes through time. And he's looked at the effects of the rate of environmental change, genetic variance, phenotypic plasticity, and reproductive rate on how reliable trait signals are predictors of population collapse. And he's basically able to show that the greater the rate of environmental change, the weaker there would be trait-based signals. So if the environment moves really fast, the population just collapses without there being warning signals prior to that collapse. When there's high genetic variance in the population, you get stronger trait-based signals. So you get that that shift with the environment, but this is really only when the environmental change is slow. Fast environmental change overrules all of that ability to track the shift. When phenotypic plasticity is high, you get stronger trait signals, and when reproductive rate is high, you also get stronger trait signals. So I'm going to shamelessly plug our paper. If any of this has sounded at all interesting to you, this came out a couple of months ago now. We go a lot into the theory behind early warning signals, a lot of the different methods that have been developed, and the key issues with them, particularly in a conservation context, and also the future directions, what kind of future questions that need answering before these are going to be widely applicable to a lot of different systems. And in terms of the future, so I think there's a lot more to be done with traits. Particularly, I'm interested in kind of tying that into the spatial early warning signals, so autocorrelation between patches and spatial patterning. In a single species context, I think the next step is going to be to look at these in metapopulations and look at trait shifts between patches and metapopulations, which is something we can do experimentally, which I'm quite excited to try. I'm also particularly interested in looking to see whether we can predict invasiveness of species from shifts in traits, which could be another really interesting, particularly kind of Australia-relevant piece of work. In terms of multi-species, so my current project is on multi-species kind of complex early warning signals in complex systems. So particularly coral reefs I've been thinking about and chatting to a few people about, and also further in the North Seas fisheries model, so predicting the collapse by shifts in multiple different species at the same time in these kind of more complex systems. And also developing some further indicators of collapse, so shifts in the age structure of population or the sex ratios or biomass ratios within those systems. Again, if anything has sounded interesting, if you have systems which you think this might be useful for, so abundance or biomass data, trait-based or spatial signals, then I'm around for the next couple of days. Feel free to drop me an email, it'd be great to chat. I think that's it. I'll have to take any questions.
resolution of your data?
So this is a yearly, yeah. So the actual simulation, I think, is it's less than that. So it's not my model. But yeah, I think the stochastic processes are on less than that, but they're effectively, it's a yearly reproducing species, and the resolution is yearly. But that's definitely a question which is interesting. So what scale, effectively, should you look at for early warning signals in terms of what data, how long is an appropriate length of data? So years is probably not really the right scale to be thinking of. It's probably more in terms of generations, because if your species reproduces once every 60 years, then 60 years of data is maybe not enough to pick up these kind of abundant space fluctuations, but then it might be to do stuff like traits where you're losing. Yeah, that is something we are thinking about.
In that same section, you have this plot of the concurrent years where there was early warning signals, and that was decreasing as the rate of fishing decreased. Could you?
Yeah, so it's a function of there being a shorter data set, basically. So at the highest rates of decline of fishing, it goes from maximum fishing to zero fishing within 10 years. And so you're getting 2 concurrent signals, but some of those populations are going to recover quicker. It's a stochastic system. So we did 100 replicates of each of those. The majority of those will have recovered within 5 years. So you're still getting concurrent signals, but it's just a short time series, basically.
Imagine one of the cool outcomes of this would be if you do remove fishing pressure or whatever is the stressor, and then you want to predict whether it's going to recover before it actually does. You want to measure a bunch of traits. So I'm wondering in that context, what would be your guidance for all big traits that you go out and measure?
Yeah, so we've only really thought about body size. I mean, particularly in fisheries, it's the trait that is, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's pretty much the trait that's collected. It determines everything. It determines your quota, your reproduction, and everything. So I've kind of only thought about that, really. I'm probably not the right person to ask in terms of traits that, like, I tend to not be an expert on the systems that I'm applying it to, but I tend to rope in other people who are. Yeah.
So on that point, I think the trait that's under selection is age at first reproduction in those animals. That's the thing that really is the crunch point for fish and whales and everything. When they start having, like they have a early death, they're the ones that breed earlier are the only ones that pass their genes on.
Yeah.
I think that's been shown in a few fish
Okay,
as an early warning, rather than just size.
Yeah, okay.
So that would be a good thing to look at.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that sounds interesting.
People do collect that information in there. It's easy to see in the fish if it's breeding or not.
I think they're probably size and that are correlated, right? Because if you're not having the largest individuals in anymore, effectively, because size and age are co-vary in the model. So I think that will be picked up, but explicitly looking at that might be very interesting.
So in the early warning signals of recovery, you had some false positives.
Yeah.
Have you looked for early warning signals of collapse in a non-collapse system using trait-based metrics?
In the trait-based, yeah. So we did it in the experimental system, which we had a control in, and there are still some false positives. It depends on the length of the data, as with all these things. In the whales, we couldn't do it because we didn't have data on populations that didn't collapse. So we kind of went around this tortuous route of like doing sliding window approaches and doing it backwards and all this other stuff to try and get around it. And I think like you're always going to have false positives. The kind of one of the maybe interesting questions is where you set the threshold. So if you set a low threshold where you're going to get more false positives, but you're going to capture all the ones that might be showing any warning signal. I think this kind of, so we go into this a little bit in the ecology space, but it kind of depends where you see these methods fitting in. So the more complex you make any of these methods, the less applicable they are to lots of different systems. I kind of see them as an easy first pass way of identifying what populations or systems might be at risk, and therefore you can start to do more work on those systems, but they're never going to be 100% foolproof. My kind of maybe slightly silly thought is that I think you could probably predict the collapse of a population from 2 time points. If you have mean body size at 2 time points, as long as you know that that shift in size over that number of generations is more than the population can effectively take into account. So that like extreme extrapolation of it. If you have some understanding of the genetic variants and phenotypes, that you could do it from 2 points. I don't know if that's ever possible, but I'd be interested to look at it.
It's sort of on the same thing again. Whenever you hit thresholds, that always adds in these kind of issues. Is there any, have you thought about other ways of approaching without using a threshold?
Yeah, it's kind of difficult. So there have been a number of different ways. So one is looking at basically the rate of increase of the metric through time. So either looking at a slope or the Kendall tower through time. It's really difficult to get around. There's a kind of trade-off between, do you have something that is non-quantitative and you just have experts looking at it and saying that looks like a warning signal, which is never really a good way to go. At least if you put a threshold on it, you're giving an actual something that you can work from. So the one that we typically use is you basically look at the rolling mean of the metric, and if it exceeds its rolling standard deviation by more than 2 standard deviations, then it's considered an early warning signal. So effectively, has the metric passed out of 95% of its historic fluctuation, which seems, I don't know, it seems relatively intuitive and a good argument, but yeah.
So you had there was a question about false positives, and I'm wondering, I think you've already somewhat addressed this, but earlier you showed some microcosm experiments that you did, and there's the potential to look at false positives there.
Yeah, we did that.
Into some detail about the false positives.
Yeah, so we looked at the rate of false positives to false negatives in the false positive, false negatives, true positive, and true negatives, and including the traits definitely improved it. You still got some false positives, but again, it's dependent on how much data you've got and how high quality the data is. But
So what is kind of the typical ratio of false positives?
I actually can't remember. Certainly in the recovery stuff, it was about, when it was working, you'd get almost 100%. True positives and about 25% false positives. So, yeah. Yeah.
Cool. Excellent. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.